Episode 1. The first night she spoke, they found her curled up on the thin mattress, trembling and bleeding from the nose, her lips whispering a language none of them understood. It was past midnight when the screams began, not ordinary screams, but violent, guttural cries spoken in Latin so old and precise, it made the crucifix above the door rattle. Sister Agnes was the first to reach Clara's room. She swore she felt the air grow colder with every syllable the girl uttered. The candle in her hand flickered out. Though there was no wind, Clara had been silent all day. 18 years old, orphaned, with skin pale as unbaked bread and eyes that never met yours for too long. She arrived at the convent of St. Timothy 2 weeks prior, after her last foster family gave her up, claiming she prayed too much to something that never answered. The nuns took her in with reluctant kindness. But tonight, as they gathered around her bed, none of them saw a girl, they saw a vessel, a trembling oracle spilling words that didn't belong in this century. Ex ignis intrat templum, ad angelus fugit. Behold, fire enters the temple, and the angel flees. Sister Agnes dropped to her knees, fingers fumbling a rosary. Sister Marta, older and less shaken, recorded what she could hear on a trembling notebook. Clara's voice grew deeper, rasped until it was no longer hers. It sounded like a man, a priest maybe, or a dying bishop. Then, silence. The girl collapsed, her breath shallow, blood trickled from her nose and ears, staining the white sheets with crimson echoes. The next morning, they questioned her. Clara blinked in confusion. I don't remember dreaming, she said softly. Was I loud? They hesitated. Sister Marta showed her the Latin phrases, now transcribed. Clara looked at the page, as if it were written in symbols from another world. I don't know what that means, she whispered. I've never learned Latin. Sister Agnes, despite trembling hands, placed a crucifix beside Clara's bed. Don't worry, child, she said. This is a house of God. Nothing evil walks here. But that night, as Clara closed her eyes, the shadows along the convent walls seemed to sway, and a soft echo, almost undetectable, whispered from her room once again. Adveniat regnum, morcor. Episode 2. Words older than her blood. Clara woke with the taste of iron in her mouth. Her pillow was soaked red. Blood. Again. But it wasn't just from her nose. This time her gums were raw, as if she had bitten something in her sleep, or screamed until her mouth tore itself open. She sat her day up slowly. The crucifix Sister Agnes had left by her bed had fallen. The nails on Christ's hands had come loose, and his eyes on say painted with compassion were now chipped into something closer to terror. Clara touched her lips. They were trembling. I didn't dream, she said aloud. But that wasn't true. She remembered flashes, a golden chalice tipping over, wine pouring like a river onto white marble, a cathedral in ruins, a man dressed in red robes weeping as shadows circled him, whispering in a language made of smoke, and beneath it all, a voice hers, not her chanting. Mater dolorosa, sisabivas amin, sorrowful mother, receive my voice. Downstairs, in the convent library, Sister Marta Saturday hunched over a dusty Latin lexicon. She had transcribed every phrase Clara had uttered the night before, now covering 6 full pages. But the words, they weren't simply Latin. They were ecclesiastical Latin, mixed with fragments from apocryphal texts the church had long forbidden. She found one line particularly troubling. Et verbum ius ardebit in carne innocenti, and his word shall burn within innocent flesh. She slammed the book shut, hands trembling. That phrase had only appeared once before in the Codex Obscura, a manuscript believed to have been destroyed by the Vatican in 1477 after 3 priests were found dead with their tongues removed and Latin scrawled across their torsos in blood. How could Clara, an orphan with no theological education, speak this? Later that afternoon, Sister Agnes approached Clara in the garden. The girl was sitting beneath the statue of Saint Timothy, sketching on an old notebook. At first, it looked like a stained glass window, but upon closer inspection, Sister Agnes realized it was melting. The colors were bleeding, the faces of saints were dripping, and in the center of the drawing was a mouth open amid screams surrounded by words Clara had written consciously. Domus Dei, Vasum Crucis non audit. The house of God no longer hears the voice of the cross. Sister Agnes stepped back, the hairs on her arms rising. "Clara," she asked cautiously, "do you know what that means?" Clara looked up, startled, as if waking from a trance. "I don't even remember drawing it." That night, they locked Clara's door. But it didn't matter. By 3:33 a.m., her screams filled the convent again, this time deeper, echoing like a chorus from an ancient cathedral. The walls shivered, the crucifix in the chapel cracked down the middle, and far away, buried beneath the convent's stone floor, something stirred. Episode 3. The nun who tried to silence her. She arrived just before dusk, dressed in black, her veil stiff with starch, her eyes sharp as razors behind round spectacles. Her name was Sister Beatrice, but to those who knew the old rites, she was whispered about as the veiled blade and untrained in rites the church had buried, one of the few remaining women sanctioned to perform an intercessory severance, an unofficial form of exorcism. She hadn't been called in years, but Clara's screams had reached Rome. They hadn't sent help, they'd sent a cleaner. Sister Beatrice wasted no time with introductions. Within an hour of arrival, she was in Clara's room, observing the girl had just woken from another scream-to-filled sleep, sweat clinging to her collarbones, her fingernails caked in blood scratching at the stone wall again. Beatrice studied her. Clara looked empty, but beneath that vacancy, something else lurked, something watching her back. "What is your name?" Beatrice asked. "Clara," she whispered. "What is the name inside you?" Clara blinked. "There is no one inside me." Sister Beatrice nodded once. "Not yet," she murmured. At midnight, the ritual began, not in the chapel, but in the basement beneath the convent where echoes didn't travel. Candles were lit in a perfect circle. Latin psalms were scratched into the floor with consecrate chalk. Clara stood at the center, eyes wide, barefoot. Beatrice's voice thundered through the underground stone. "Recede, lingua mortuorum, asta nomentum, withdraw, tongue of the dead, reveal your name." At first nothing. Then Clara gasped. Her eyes rolled back, her hands clenched, and from her mouth, a scream like fire burst into the room so loud, the candles flickered violently and blew out. She began to laugh, but not her laugh. A man's laugh, edged, hoarse, triumphant. Sunnis est clavis, ecclesia tremit. Blood is the key. The church will tremble. Sister Beatrice stepped back, heart racing. This wasn't possession. It was invocation. Clara wasn't carrying a demon. She was channeling something older, a voice that didn't cling to flesh like a parasite, but one that waited to be remembered. A voice that knew the secret cracks in the church's walls and how to bring them down. Beatrice closed the circle, her chant faltering. She had come to silence a demon, but what stood before her now was not a cursed girl. It was a prophecy, and it had already begun speaking. Episode 4. The Choir of the Damned. It began with a hum, barely audible at first, just a low, trembling tone that echoed down the convent stone halls like a sigh trapped between walls. Sister Marta was the first to hear it at exactly 3:33 am as she passed Clara's door with a lit candle and a whispered prayer. She paused. The sound was beautiful. No, terrible. It was both. And then Clara screamed. But this scream was not like the others. It wasn't hers alone. It was layered, like a chorus, an eruption of voices, all emerging from Clara's mouth at once. Men and women, old and young, shrieking in sacred Latin. A symphony of agony and devotion, of lament and praise. Some voices were sobbing, others were laughing. One was clearly reciting a mass. The candle in Sister Marta's hand exploded, hot wax burning her wrist. She stumbled backward, clutching her crucifix. Eyes wide with terror, Clara's door burst open. Sister Beatrice was already there, rosary in one hand, a vial of holy water in the other. Clara stood in the center of her room, arms spread wide as if crucified by invisible nails. Her eyes were rolled back, blood streamed from both nostrils. Her bare feet hovered 2 inches above the floor, and still she screamed. But it wasn't noise, it was language. Hundreds of voices, speaking together. One phrase echoed through the madness. Confessio, non facta, est damnatio. The confession not made is damnation. By sunrise, Clara lay unconscious. The room smelled of incense and something rotten. Above her bed, the crucifix had twisted face of Christ turned backwards. as if he no longer wished to watch. Sister Beatrice gathered the nuns in the chapel. Her voice was cold. "She's not alone," she said. "She is a vessel, but not for a demon, for memory." "Memory?" Sister Agnes asked. Beatrice nodded. Voices that should have been heard, that were silenced. She lay out parchment covered in ink smudged with sweat. I translated part of the chorus. It names priests, confessors, locations, and sins that echo too closely to real scandals. Sister Marta paled. "You're saying Clara is remembering things she never experienced?" "I'm saying," Beatrice whispered, "she's remembering things the church forgot on purpose." That night, no one slept, and at precisely 3:33 a.m., Clara began again, this time not in scream. Episode 5. The priest who had the key. He walked with a limp and carried a Bible that hadn't been opened in 20 years. Father Remio arrived unannounced. Just after Vespers, the nuns gathered at the chapel door as his silhouette emerged from the mistal. Hunched, with eyes like frostbitten glass, Sister Beatrice recognized him immediately. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I never should have left," he replied. He had once been the confessor of St. Dimph's convent, until one night in 1993, when he vanished without a word, leaving behind a locked chapel and a rumor that he'd gone mad. The church gave no explanation, neither did it, but now Clara screamed in the language of forgotten confessions, and something buried beneath the chapel wanted out. They brought him to her room. Clara was awake but pale. Her wrists were bandaged from sleepwalking injuries. Her voice had been silent for 3 days, but she no longer needed to speak to frighten them. Now, she watched, eyes locked on people with a gaze that felt like it peeled the flesh from their souls. Father Remio stepped inside. The door closed behind him. She didn't flinch. She smiled, and then she said, clear and calm, "Aperi me, tu fuisti custos ossium." "Open me, you are the keeper of bones." The priest staggered. That phrase had heard it once before, not from a girl, but from a dying monk in the hills of Languedoc. During his first pilgrimage, that monk had burned himself alive after whispering those exact words. Father Remio dropped to his knees. He opened his Bible, tearing out the inner lining. Inside, yellowed with age, was a map of the convent, but it was incomplete until now. Clara reached under her mattress and withdrew a page. It was a perfect match, drawn in her sleep, inked in her blood. The map led to a hollow in the wall beneath the altar, a sealed compartment, bricked up and forgotten. Inside, they found a wooden box, no larger than a loaf of bread, bound in rosary beads, wrapped in cloth that smelled of myrrh and mildew. Father Remio opened it with trembling hands. Inside a tome, dried, blackened, wrapped in parchment covered in Latin. Confessio abscissa, vox de relicta, confession severed, voice of God abandoned. Suddenly, the chapel bell rang. No one had pulled the rope, and from the far end of the corridor, Clara began to sing again. But this time, it wasn't Latin, it was Aramaic, the language of Christ. Episode 6. The cross that burned without flame. It began to melt at dawn. The crucifix above Clara's bedroom, forged in Florence in the 1800s, dripped like wax. First the arms, then the legs, then the crown of thorns, all sagging in slow, sorrowful collapse. But the strangest part wasn't the heat. That metal wasn't hot. In fact, when Sister Agnes touched it, she screamed it from burns, but from cold, a cold so pure, so impossible, it blistered her skin. Clara, lying in bed, was whispering again, not Latin, not even Aramaic. This time, it was silence, but the silence had shape. Sister Beatrice recorded her on an old tape recorder. The machine captured nothing but static, yet when played backward, hidden beneath the hiss, a voice emerged, non in Latin, non in Luz, sed in Visayas, incipient finis, not in fire, not in light, but in her voice. The end shall begin. That same morning, blood was discovered in the library. It trailed from the shelves to the altar, like a crimson ribbon, but there was no body, no wound, just droplets fresh, thick, and still warm. Sister Marta took samples and followed the trail. It ended at a painting that hung crooked on the chapel's eastern wall. She removed it. Behind the canvas was a sealed niche. Inside it, a handwritten confession. dated 1881, signed by the first priest of St. Dimphnus Convent. We tried to silence her. We burned her tongue, but the voice returned in the next Virgin, and the next. It will never leave until lasered. The page ended with one phrase, scrawled in blood, Crux sine Eden, vox sine carne, a cross without fire, a voice without flesh. That night, Father Remiel stood alone in Clara's room. The crucifix above her bed now hung as twisted metal. Her eyes fluttered beneath pale lids. He whispered prayers over her, trembling. Then she opened her eyes and smiled. Not kindly, she whispered in a voice that was his own. You sealed it, and now it opens through me. The lights shattered, the walls shook, the windows split like spiderwebs, and in the chapel above, the massive iron cross burst into flames, but produced no heat, no smoke, only the overwhelming sin of myrrh and rot. The flames danced like shadows cast by unseen saints, and in the center of the blaze, the image of a girl, faceless, bound in thorns. Clara's voice rose from below, but it wasn't a scream, it was a call. Episode 7, Confession at 3:33 a.m. Sister Lucille hadn't spoken in 12 years. Not since the fire, not since the orphanage where she once lived was reduced to ash and bone and smoke, and she emerged the only survivor. Her silence had been mistaken for piety. In truth, it was fear made flesh. But that night, at 3:33 a.m., Clara whispered her name. Lucille was standing outside Clara's room, rosary tied in her fingers, waiting for the usual screaming to begin. But this time, it was different. No howling, no language of the dead, just one soft, breathless phrase. Lucille, I saw what you did in the attic. Lucille frowned. See, no one knew about the attic. No one could have known. 15 years ago, when Lucille was still a teenager, she and another girl, Marie, had snuck away to escape the cold. They lit candles, played with stories, dared each other to say forbidden prayers. Marie had told a secret that night, one about a priest. Lucille had panicked. She hadn't meant to push her, not down the stairs, not like that. Marie's body was never found. The fire had come only hours later. Lucille never spoke again, until now. She entered Clara's room without knocking. The girl lay still, eyes closed, mouth barely moving, but her lips were shaping words that chewed Lucille's marrow. Pactum non confessum, in anima ardet, esse non confessed, burns in the soul. Lucille dropped to her knees beside the bed. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered. Clara's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time, she looked directly at Lucille, not with judgment, not with hatred, but with pity. You must confess, Clara said in a voice not hers, or the fire will come again, and it will not stop with wood. By sunrise, Lucille was gone. Her room was empty, her bed untouched, her rosary snapped in two. They found her cloak near the well behind the convent. Floating above it was ash. That same morning, Father Remiel approached Sister Beatrice with trembling hands. He had deciphered a new pattern in Clara's speech, a hidden thread. Each name Clara had whispered, each sin revealed. They weren't random. They were part of a list, a litany of unfinished confessions. The dead, the guilty, the silent, and Clara was delivering them one by one. That night, the bell tolled once more at 3:33 a.m., and Clara whispered a new name. This time I was Sister Marta, and she hadn't even known she was guilty. Not dead. Episode 8, The Latin She Never Learned. He arrived with a suitcase full of dead languages. Dr. Theo Marin, linguistic scholar, Vatican consultant, an expert in ancient tongues lost to time and ash. His beard was unkempt, his eyes sleepless, and his hands trembled when he spoke. He you not from fear, from reverence. I read the transcripts, he said as he stepped into Clara's dimly lit room. She's not speaking Latin. Sister Beatrice frowned. Then was it, he knelt beside Clara's bed and laid out pages of her phrases, annotated by ink in desperation. It's proto-ecclesiastical Latin, he whispered, hybridized with fragments of lingua obscura. Sister Marta leaned in. That's just mythology. Theo looked up, face pale. No, it was outlawed. by the Council of Carthage in 397 AD. Only a handful of priests were ever trained in it. They called it the tongue of the veil, used in liturgies meant to speak to God, or something pretending to be him. Clara began to stir. Her lips parted it in scream, not in prayer but in chant, a slow, haunting melody carved from syllables no one in the room should have understood. But Theo did, and what he heard made him fall to his knees. In sanguine script est fire, in virgin reddit verbum, the path is written in blood. The word returns through the virgin. Clara's eyes opened, glazed over with a milky sheen, and then she spoke, staring directly at Theo. Tu fuisti inter dias. You were among them? Theo's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled back, clutching his chest, eyes wild. No, he muttered, that's impossible. I only translated. I never spoke it aloud. I never practiced. Clara sat up, spine straight as a blade. Et nunc vox quaer it hastium. And now, the voice seeks a host. Later that night, Theo locked himself in the library. He scoured his notes, eyes darting across pages, trying to make sense of what Clara had said. He found references to the vox veritatis forbidden rite that allowed the divine word to inhabit flesh, not as possession, but as resonance, a perfect echo. He thought it was symbolic, but now he feared something else. Clara wasn't just speaking the words, she was becoming the word. At 3:33 a.m., Theo was found unconscious at the altar. Written in chalk around him was a single Latin phrase, circled like a summoning sigil, Loquela facta caro est. The voice has become flesh, and in Clara's room, without making a sound, her mouth moved once more, but this time, the walls replied. Episode 9. The Vision Through the Veil. It started with a pencil. Clara had not been allowed sharp objects in days, but somehow, one appeared beside her, beveled, splintered, as if it had been buried and dug up again. No one could explain where it came from. At 2:11 a.m., she sat up in the dark and began to draw. No light, no hesitation. By dawn, her bed sheets were covered in sketches. At first glance, a cathedral, towering, Gothic, black spires like spears through the sky. But the details impossible. The architecture bent inwards, doorways shaped like screaming mouths, stained glass windows bleeding color that seemed to shift when stared at long. Latin inscriptions coiled around the arches like serpents. In the center of the church, an altar, split in two, and kneeling before it, head bowed in, chains, a girl with Clara's face. Sister Beatrice stood over the drawings with clenched fists. She knew this church. She had seen it once, 40 years ago, when she was still a novice in Rome. She had stumbled into the Vatican's black Archivia place, whispered about in corners of convents and seminaries, but rarely named. There, she had seen a photo, a black and white image of a sealed church, deep in the catacombs of southern France. Its door was chained shut by papal order in 1891, after 3 cardinals and 5 choir boys vanished during a midnight mass. The Vatican erased it from maps. The locals refused to speak of it, but Clara had drawn it perfectly. Every symbol, every crack in the stone, even the Latin above the door, Ecclesia Doloris, Aperita Perversum, Church of Sorrow, opened by the voice. Beatrice confronted Father Remiel, slamming the drawing onto his desk. Did you know this? She hissed. The old priest stared at the image, his hands visibly trembling. I tried to forget, he muttered. They made us sign silence. They said it was never to be spoken again. She's never been to France. Beatrice said she should know this. Remiel looked up, eyes hollow. She doesn't know it. She remembers it. That night, Clara didn't scream. She stood, eyes closed, lips sealed, but in her hands, she clutched a charcoal pencil made from bone. She pressed it to the wall and wrote a single line. Ostium aperiter, sunis paratus est. The door is opening. The blood is ready. And in the silence that followed, the ground beneath the convent shook. Not an earthquake, a summoning. Episode 10. The angel who refused to enter her room. He came from the Vatican wearing white gloves and carrying a reliquary wrapped in silk. Father Dorian, a priest known not for his sermons, but for what followed in their silence. He didn't perform public masses. He didn't serve a parish. He was sent only when the church feared something that couldn't be buried with doctrine. In his hands, a fragment of Saint Cecilia's spine, sealed in crystal, a relic said to hum faintly when in the presence of the divine. But as he stepped into the hall leading to Clara's room, the reliquary grew still. Cold, heavy, the hum stopped, then reversed, emitting a low, grinding vibration, like bone dragged across glass. Father Dorian paused. He prayed under his breath, and the reliquary shuddered in his hands. Inside the room, Clara was sitting on the floor, drawing again, but this time she wasn't looking at the paper. Her eyes were shut. Her hands moved like she was tracing something not in front of her, but inside her. The drawing, a wing, gigantic, mangled, missing feathers. Words spiraled around it like smoke. Angelus noluit intrare, vox ius exurit. The angel refused to enter. Her voice scorches him. Father Dorian stepped forward, lifting the reliquary high. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy. The relic cracked right down the middle. The sound echoed through the convent like the breaking of time itself. Sister Beatrice cried out and lunged forward, pulling Dorian back just as the reliquary exploded in a cloud of fine ash and splinters. No fire, no heat, just a single feather blackened and curled that fell gently to the floor. Clara looked up. Her eyes were no longer white, more glazed. They were utterly human, but filled with a grief so deep it could drown the world. He stood at my door, she whispered, and wept. Father Dorian, shaken to his knees, whispered, "What are you?" Clara turned to him, head tilted like a child listening for a faraway melody. "I am not the darkness," she said softly. "I am what it remembers." That night, the walls of the convent began to bleed, lines of red trailing down from cracks shaped like wings. And in that chapel, a statue of Saint Michael fell forward, shattering at the feet of the altar. Its face was missing. Its hands were raised not in blessing, but in surrender. Episode 11. The Latin stops. The blood begins. For the first time in 33 nights, Clara did not scream. No chants, no invocations, no voices from beyond the veil. Only silence. A silence so thick it pressed on the lungs like smoke. A silence that made the nuns hesitate to speak, afraid they might rupture something sacred or worse, something fragile. Sister Marta crept to Clara's room at dawn. The door was ajar. The air inside was bitter cold, and on the walls, blood, not spattered, not smeared, written, lines and lines of Latin text, perfectly straight, impossibly neat, covering every inch from floor to ceiling. Phrases that bent and spiraled like scripture from an inverted heaven. Marta collapsed to her knees, hands trembling. She could read them, every word. Non est vox demonis, est vox relicta, ecclesia surda, ergo lapis sequenter. This is not the voice of a demon. It is a forsaken voice. The church is deaf. Therefore, the stones must speak. Clara was lying on the bed, eyes open, lips parted, not a drop of blood on her body, not a scratch. Yet the words were written in her blood. They tested it later. DNA confirmed it. Beatrice watched the results fall from her hands like ash. She's bleeding without wounds. She whispered, "The words are using her." Father Remiel stepped into the room, crossing himself 3 times. His gaze scanned the walls, and he frowned when he saw one sentence repeated over and over. "Tu sis, tu siles, ergo tu damaris." You knew, you were silent, therefore you are damned. His hands began to shake, because 30 years ago, in this very convent, he had buried something he thought would never return. A diary, a confession, a name, a girl. That night, Clara remained silent, but something had changed. She no longer looked like a victim or a vessel. She looked like a witness, as though she had heard all the cries the church ignored, and now they were speaking through her silence. At 3:33 a.m., every bell in the convent rang. No one pulled them, and in that chapel, the altar cloth turned red, not from above, but from within the stone. Episode 12. The Prophecy of the Virgin's Tongue. The silence ended with a whisper. At 4:04 a.m., Clara opened her mouth. No scream, no chant, just a single breathless phrase. Gloria inversa, inverted glory. The candles in the convent's chapel, long burned out, ignited at once, without flame, without heat, just light cold, colorless. Wrong. Sister Beatrice woke from her sleep gasping, blood seeping from her ears. They gathered around Clara's room by morning. Father Remiel stood at the door, with the trembling certainty of a man who knows judgment is near. Clara sat upright, her back straight, hands folded in her lap like a saint carved from marble, but her eyes were on fire, not with rage, with revelation. She began to speak, slowly, clearly. Et venit dies, in quo ecclesia non plorat super crucem, sed super se, and the day shall come, when the church does not weep for the cross, but for itself. Theo, the linguist, rushed to scribble down every word, but even as he wrote, his hands shook not from fear, but from understanding. This wasn't prophecy, it was confession, and not Clara's. Each phrase she uttered traced hidden lines through church history, names, dates, cathedrals long condemned or mysteriously destroyed. Each syllable peeled back a layer of holy concealment, and beneath it all, rot. Clara turned her head and locked eyes with Father Remiel. You silenced her, she said it in Latin, but in perfect, unwavering English. She was the first, I am the last. The old priest collapsed. He didn't deny it. 30 years ago, a girl named Serafina was found speaking in ancient tongues. She was 13. They said she was possessed, that she needed saving. She was buried beneath the floor of the chapel, alive. Remiel had overseen the rite. Now Clara was her voice, and Serafina's final breath had become prophecy. At 3:33 p.m., as the sun bled red through the stained glass, Clara spoke the final verse. Et in or virginis, verbum ultimum scriptor, and in the virgin's mouth, the final word shall be written. As she finished, blood spilled from her lips, not dripping, but forming a single letter, a rune, ancient, forbidden. Theo gasped, it's not Latin. He whispered, Beatrice asked, then what is it? He looked at Clara, who now smiled with solemn peace. It's the first letter of his true name, Theo said, the one the church buried before Christ ever hung on a cross. The walls began to rumble. Outside, the bell tower cracked, and below their feet, the earth shifted as if something once sealed was finally stretching, awakening, preparing to rise. Final episode 13. She woke up knowing everything. At 3:33 a.m., the convent fell silent. No chants, no bells, no screams. Even the wind held its breath. Then Clara opened her eyes, and for the first time in 13 nights, she was awakened at speaking in ancient tongues, not channeling forgotten prophecies, just awake and smiling. Sister Beatrice stood near the doorway, rosary slack in her hand, pulse trembling in her throat. Clara, she whispered. The girl turned, her gaze calm clear, like polished glass that had seen eternity and come back understanding. I remember, Clara said. Her voice was her own, but behind it was all of themed screams. The tongues, the vanished girls, the buried sins, all that had passed through her mouth now belonged to her. She stood, no shaking, no fear. The air around her shimmered slightly, as if the room itself bowed in reverence to the thing she had become. In the chapel, the floor split with a thunderous crack. Dust rained from the ceiling. Beneath the altar, a tomb-long seal broke open, revealing bones twisted in prayer. A child's skeleton, mouth still agape. Serafina, Sister Marta screamed. Father Remiel collapsed in tears beside the tomb, whispering, I was told it was mercy. I was told she was too dangerous. Clara entered the chapel barefoot, her steps silent but seismic. She walked to Serafina's bones, knelt, placed a hand on the child's skull, and whispered something none of them understood, but the bones dissolved into light. Theo stepped forward, voice trembling. What are you now? Clara looked at him gently, with a sadness too ancient for her face. I am not possessed, she said. I was never possessed. I was prepared. A sound erupted then, not from her, from above. A great, vibrating tone like an organ made from the ribs of angels. The stained glass windows shattered inward, showering the pews in multicolored shards. In the wind that rushed through the open frame, all scenes of voices whispered at once. In Latin, Aramaic, Greek, and something older still. The ground quaked. The crucifix split down the middle. And then, silence. One final, perfect silence. Clara turned, her eyes now golden, not glowing, just true. She looked at Beatrice, at Theo, at the remaining sisters, and spoke one last sentence. I am the word they tried to silence. Then she walked through the chapel doors, into the red morning light, and was never seen again. Aftermath. The Vatican sealed the convent within a week. All records erased. The remaining nuns reassigned, dispersed, silenced, but sometimes relics.
Epilogue. The Last Chapel. The chapel was small, forgotten, hidden in a village that no longer appeared on maps, where the roads ended in grass and the air held the scent of smoke and myrrh. No tourists came, no priests served, but every Sunday, without fail, a girl lit a candle. She sat in the pews alone. She never prayed aloud. She only listened. Villagers whispered about her. They said she arrived one winter wrapped in a gray shawl, barefoot, with eyes like dying stars. They didn't know her name, but the children called her La Palabra, the word. One night, an old man, a bishop in hiding, came to see for himself. He entered the chapel just past midnight, a crucifix clutched in one hand, a flask in the other. His steps echoed against the cold stone. When he approached the altar, he saw her sitting in the dark, waiting. She turned to him, smiled faintly, then spoke. Only once. Do you remember what you buried? The next morning, the chapel's door was open. Inside, the bishop was gone, but etched into the wall above the altar, in blood no longer wet and yet never dry, was a single phrase. Verbum factum est. Et ambulat. The word became flesh and walks. No one has seen her since. But sometimes, deep in the night, in churches with locked doors and broken bells, a candle will flicker to life, and a voice, soft as a sigh, will whisper, "You silenced the wrong girl."